to your introductory and your framework about the tripartite in psychology, that is cognition, perception, and emotion. I think psychology has omitted or downplayed one very, very important, similarly important focus, and that is the action part. Action, when you then continue to talk about your material, behavior pervaded everything, right? And so what I just first like to state is that the motor system, action, motor control should be, and it's not your fault, psychology that has somewhat neglected that, should be a similarly important player. And I think it is coming increasingly to the fore and has very many links with what you're doing. And so just to
Absolutely. So I will say a couple of things about that. I think if you, first of all, there are other models of the mind that are not Western that pay much more attention to behavior than Western views do. But it's not that Western views have never paid attention to action. They certainly have. It's just they kind of got a bad rap when they did. So, you know, there was a history to every field, and in psychology there was a history of, you know, basically as people started off believing that that there were basic mental faculties which produced behavior, and they did tons of studies and found they couldn't identify these mental faculties. And so what they ended up doing was just focusing on behavior, not action, but behavior. Those are actually different things in psychology. And I could give you a whole lecture on how they're different, but they are. You know, so an action is my fist just touched the table. A behavior is I just pounded the table. When you say I pounded the table, you make an inference about my intention when I made this action. Okay? So in psychology, there was a study of behavior almost to the exclusion of the mind for many years, and then that paradigm was kind of overturned, and then people withdrew from the study of behavior. It almost became not a good thing. But I think in the last 20 years, there's been very much a return, not just to the study of behavior, but the study of action, and the importance of action. So it turns out that if I show you a picture of a hammer, or I show you an actual hammer, or I just say the word hammer, there are regions of the brain involved in action that are active, right? If I show you an apple, or I say the word apple, or I give you an apple and let you hold it in your hand, there are similar parts of the brain that are active. So the motor system is actually hugely important, as you well know, to all sorts of mental states that normally, or I would say that up until maybe the last 2 decades, psychologists kind of ignored. And it was like a big discovery that people made again, like, oh my goodness, the action system is important.
Two small comments that parallel what you have been shown, namely the non-specificity of emotions or local neural sets of neurons. That is a haunting issue similarly in the control of action, and currently a big theme is brain-machine interface. How can brain states produce actions that then manipulate something when, for example, people are paralyzed? And the notorious problem there is that there is no area that is specific to a certain action, not behavior.
Right.
And the other point, the last point that you made about the semantic dementia, there is similarly evidence that action and the memory of action has interference with lexical skills and lexical tasks and memorized tasks. So there's a lot of things in parallel that is coming to the fore these days.
And it's very exciting.
It is.
Yes. Yes.
You sort of teased us with those 6 different, I don't know what you call them, networks.
Yeah,
I was curious if in other species working your way down, do you still have 6?
Yeah, well, yeah, so I'm not claiming there are 6. It turns out there are 7. It's always, everything with psychologists is, everything with humans is 7 plus or minus 2. And we can talk about why that is, because that's all our working memories can hold. You know, but depending on the degree that you want, depending on the degree of specificity, it looks like intrinsic networks that are either 7 or 17 that are reliable. So this is in studies of 2,000 people that you can identify very reliably, and that are cross-culturally stable. And so the question is, do those networks also exist in non-human animals? And the answer is, most of them do, but in more constrained ways. So I'm not talking about subcortical regions here. Those are all cortical networks I showed you. They're not subcortical networks. Well, actually, a couple of them have subcortical regions. There's only really one set of networks related to executive function and attention that look like they are, one of them might be different in humans relative to other species. But in monkeys, for example, like macaques, which are often chosen as a comparison, because there are a lot of them. Chimpanzees and gorillas are very hard to study because there aren't that many of them. They're just not, the N isn't large enough, the sample size isn't large enough. But macaques are easy to study, and if you look at macaques, rhesus macaques, they have, you know, sort of pared down versions of those networks, but they're not identical. And so in the study of the brain, you can sort of emphasize what's common, or you can emphasize what's different about them relative to humans.
So are they sort of represent, I'm really curious about what they are, and you can really tell us.
Sure, so one set of, so just as an example, so you have a network in your brain that is active when you remember the past, when you imagine the future, when you engage in moral reasoning, you engage in object perception. It's active kind of all the time, except, well, actually, it's kind of active all the time. And it involves regions that are at the very front of the brain and that are involved in mind perception. And there are also regions that are sort of at the back, involved in self-relevant processing. And some regions at the base of the brain that are involved in regulating the body. And they together, they've been called things like the default network, the long-term memory network. They have a lot of different names that they give to the same network. But basically, this network is involved in taking whatever the sensory array is, which includes all the 5 senses, plus your internal physical state, and making meaning out of it. So you know how if you've ever listened to a language that you don't speak, it sounds to you like it's just noise. But if you have experience with the language, you can actually tell where the words break. And if you really are, if you speak the language, then you actually know what those sounds refer to. They refer to words. Well, that network is helping to do that task. It's helping to identify. I'm saying this, and I know Joanne is here, and it's probably a bad example. I should have used vision, because it's like grossly oversimplified what I just said. But basically, that network is involved in taking sensations and making meaning out of them based on your past experience. So that's why it's active in memory. That's why it's active in imagining the future. That's why it's active in object perception, because if you don't have experience with a face as a face, you won't know it's a face, for example. And you might ask, well, who has no experience with a face? And but there are people who are functionally blind and then have operations to remove cataracts or replace their cornea, and for the first time they see, and you know what they see the first time when input makes it to visual cortex, they see nothing, because they have no experience with the visual world, and they don't know what they don't know what the sensations refer to, and they have to learn it. So rhesus macaques also have that network. They just don't have it. It's just not as well developed and not as tightly connected. So it's a smaller network. The brain regions are smaller. The connections are weaker, but it's still a network, which suggests that also primates, other non-human primates, are also using their prior experience to structure their current experience. We just don't know what that means, right? We don't know. For us, we don't even know what that means. So we certainly don't know what that means for them. But yeah, and there are a number of networks like that where you can see similar but not identical networks in other animals. Yes?
Didn't mention the hypothalamus. Is that a whole nother talk?
that's a whole other talk. So,
Okay.
so the problem with, well, I can say a couple things about the hypothalamus. Like, I guess there are two things to say about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a brain structure, subcortical brain structure, and it's important for regulating your, what is called your homeostasis. It's important for regulating your internal state, physically. And so it's also important for these what are called behavioral adaptations, or these, these actions which are highly conserved across species, like freezing and withdrawal and attack and so on. So there are a couple things about the hypothalamus. One is that anatomic studies show that the adult human hypothalamus, for example, the lateral hypothalamus, which regulates your autonomic state, is actually different in a baby, in a human infant, than it is in an adult infant. An adult human. You know what I mean. So in a baby, the lateral hypothalamus is clustered into nuclei, just like it is in a rat. But in a grown-up, it's not. So the structure of that, I mean, that's a highly, in some ways, if you think about the hypothalamus, it's a highly conserved structure across species, but in fact, there are huge differences in the internal structure of parts of it. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, is that with neuroimaging, we'll never, I want to say we'll never see that, but it's very hard. I mean, the kinds of imaging studies that we collected for this meta-analysis just does not have the specificity in terms of the precision, in terms of the spatial resolution to find little nuclei of clusters of cells. That being said, there is the power. So for example, in fMRI, what you do is you stick someone's head in a big magnet, and then you kind of try to disrupt the magnetic signal. That's a whole other conversation. But my point is that the typical power of a magnet is 3 Tesla. But there are these other magnets, which in the past have only been used with non-human animals, like a 7 Tesla magnet. So for example, at MGH, there's a 7 Tesla magnet that you can actually use on humans. And that, we're actually doing a study right now where we're trying to image the periaqueductal gray. So what we're doing is we're focusing in only on that structure and using tiny little voxels to try to isolate particular structures. But so it's possible that the hypothalamus might be imaged soon with a sufficient degree of resolution that you could ask meaningful questions about it, but not yet. There are a whole host of problems right now, technically, with using a 17 magnet on a human, not the least of which is when you slide people into the magnet and out of the magnet, they want to throw up. It's just, you're completely nauseated by the process. So that kind of has to be fixed before you You're doing like a mood induction on your subjects before they even get their heads on the camera. So it's important, it's important, but it's emotion and it's actually important to cognition even, and attention and memory. But I think less is known about that.